Well, hello. I'm Christine Byron, and I am pleased to be interviewing Don Lystra, who wrote this wonderful book, Searching for Van Gogh, which was a Michigan notable book. And I'm going to have a little conversation with Don. So, Don, why don't you show your face? Okay, there we are.
There we
Um,
are.
okay.
Hi, Christine. It's nice to be here. I'm looking forward to talking to you about this.
Great, great. Well, so I have to ask you, give us some background on yourself and how did you become a writer?
Well, it was not the usual path, I guess. I worked during my working life as an engineer, actually, although I always had a fondness for books and language and literature. And I always had it in the back of my mind that I'd like to try writing someday. And back in the early 90s, I had a medical procedure that had a long recovery period. And I had to figure out what I was going to do with all this idle time. So I decided I'd finally try my hand at being a writer. And I did for a while. And I kind of got the bug, I guess. I really enjoyed it to the point where I wanted to sort of work it into my daily routine. Um, I was living in Ann Arbor at the time, which is a good place to try to be a writer because there's a lot of writers and would-be writers walking around Ann Arbor, and a lot of them are very good. And you get together with them in workshops, and slowly you improve what you're doing, and that's kind of what happened to me. So that's kind of a snapshot, I guess, of how I came to be a writer of fiction.
So, what was the first spark that really um, ignited that you decided you wanted to write?
Um, well, I don't know. I guess I'd have to go way back to when I was, a young man or even a teenager. There was just something about writing and reading fiction that connected with me, even though my skills at that time, anyway, were in a different direction. Math and science were the strong points I had as an academic sort of person. Um, but I don't know exactly what it was that kindled the spark, Christine. Just reading and kind of getting a connection, feeling a connection with what I was reading. Um, Somebody, I think the author C.S. Lewis, said that we read to know that we're not alone. And maybe that was what the connection was. You have certain feelings and emotions and ideas, and sometimes you wonder whether you're crazy or not, but then you read a good author and he describes them in much better language than you could, and you realize you have a connection there. So maybe that was what was happening to me.
Sure, sure. So, how did you get the idea for this book particularly? I know this is your third book that I'm aware of, right? Not just this third,
That's
correct?
right. Yes.
Okay. And why did you set it in Grand Rapids?
Well, the idea, I had some scraps of writing that I had done years ago, and they never really matured into anything. Um, One was a scene of a young man uh, on the side of a river trying to paint a scene, who was not a painter, somebody who was kind of trying to get the artistic insights and the understanding that comes from art, but doesn't have that background, which was the case with me to some extent. Um, and I had him encounter a young woman. That's always a good way to start a story. Boy meets girl, or girl meets boy. And they have a conversation. It turns out the young woman is more knowledgeable in art, and she sort of schools him in a couple of aspects of painting, which he appreciates. And then I guess I had in mind from there it would blossom into a longer story. but I never knew what that longer story was. Uh, for about 10 years, I had that scrap sitting in my file. And every once in a while, I would take it out and read it, but nothing would come of it, But finally, a couple of years ago, I kind of saw how that could blossom into a second scene and then a whole series of scenes that would lead into a hopefully interesting story.
Yeah.
So, why I said it in Grand Rapids, I guess, and this is true of a lot of my fiction, I like to feel that I'm being authentic when I describe people and places and situations. And so I usually go back to things that I've experienced, places I've lived, people I've known. I don't turn the people I've known into characters, but I use aspects of their personality. Um, and I knew Grand Rapids very well. I lived there for the first 12 years of my life. So I knew it. And this was back in the 50s. And then I went back there as a young man for a period of time when I was actually working in a factory the way my young protagonist is working. So I guess I chose the setting. I thought Grand Rapids has an interesting history to draw on too. And it turns out that the history kind of works into the narrative a little bit. Yeah, its background as a center for furniture and all of the design and the creativity that comes along with that. Midwestern places are usually thought of as sort of humdrum and lacking excitement, but Grand Rapids was a center really of design, and in fact, a lot of what's called the mid-century modern came out of the furniture manufacturers that were working in Grand Rapids. So anyway, that's sort of the background of why I said it in Grand Rapids.
Well, it worked. I live in Grand Rapids, and I think you really captured it. The scene of, this young man of Nate, painting on the riverbank, looking at the abandoned factories across the river, and the metal bridge. I thought that really, captured it. And it was very interesting to me that you picked 1963, and that plays really, November 13th plays a key role in the book. And did that come to you as an inspiration, or was that kind of always in the background that that was going to be the time period that you set the novel in?
Well, uh, I was living in Grand Rapids in 1963. That was the period as a young man that I was a factory worker for a while. um, and so my memory of that historic event, really, the assassination of John Kennedy, was kind of vivid in my mind, and it was already associated with Grand Rapids. And I guess I wanted to set it in the early 60s too, for um, maybe for personal reasons. People always talk about the later 60s as being this period of great social upheaval and change, which is true. But it was the early 60s that really set the groundwork for that, that created the sort of society that began to come apart at the seams, a few years later. And so I like the idea of sort of going into a period of time that maybe not so many people understand and trying to show characters, acting and living in that environment and what it was like. I thought that would be an interesting thing for me to write about, but also maybe an interesting thing for people to read about. So, and the assassination of Kennedy doesn't play a big part in the story, although it comes in as sort of a background event. Um, and I guess it just felt natural for me to do that because, like I said, my memories of the Kennedy assassination were connected to Grand Rapids, and so it sort of was a natural follow through.
Sure. So, how would you define this work? Would you call it historical fiction? How would you define it?
Um, well, it's at one level, it's a coming of age story. because it's about a young man and he's encountering life and situations in life for the first time and trying to figure out how to deal with them. Um, it's set in the Midwest. I think that characterizes it to some extent. Um, at one time, I thought, well, maybe I should be writing about New York or Los Angeles or Paris or London, that. And I remember actually with a story I was writing, trying to move it to, I think it was New York City, because that was a place that people knew about, and so many stories are written in New York settings, but I couldn't make the transition. I mean, whatever it was that was creeping into my writing said something about the Midwest that really didn't translate to an East Coast situation. Um, so so anyway, that was how it came to be, um, and and I like that. I like the fact that I'm a Midwestern writer. At first, I kind of resisted it, but then I realized that that's what I was, so I might as well accept it and be happy about it. So that's sort of where I am right now.
Sure. So when you started this book, how did you approach your opening pages? Were you trying to hook, to immerse people, to immerse readers, or something else? What was your idea for just like starting the first pages of the book?
Um, that's an interesting question. Um, I guess I don't, when I write anything, whether they're opening pages or anything else, I don't, at least on the first writing, I don't have like a strategic idea in mind, that if I do this, it'll hook the reader, or if I do that, it'll open up an interesting avenue that I can explore. I'm just trying to put down something that seems vivid and honest and a true expression of something about the world. Um, and then I do go back, on a second and a third writing and try to see whether I put enough hooks and whatever else, to so the reader is having some fun too along the way.
Mhm.
and uh, I don't know. I thought that situation of the boy meeting the girl under this unusual situation, the boy not an artist but wanting to be an artist, the young woman who is knowledgeable about art, and as it develops, she also has some problems in her background. But bringing those two characters together just inherently had the possibility of interest and drama, and uh, that's why it ended up being the opening that it was.
Mhm. Well, mentioned the characters just now. Who were your favorite characters in the book? And how much of Nate was kind of semi-autobiographical for you?
Um, my favorite characters were probably, well, I don't know, I like them all. I mean, I don't really have any villains in the story. Um, and I guess that reflects something about me too. I don't think, there are angels or devils among us. We're all complicated mixtures of different strains. Um, but I suppose I liked the protagonist and the narrator, Nate, because, uh, the story was being told through his eyes. And he is going through an interesting period in his life. He has some conflicts with his family. He has a grief that he's feeling from the loss of an older brother quite recently, and he's trying to chart a path for himself just in the world. Um, I like the young woman too, um, and I've actually been surprised a little bit by some of the reactions to her. I liked her very much, and I saw her as kind of an heroic character. A young woman who has a lot of troubles in her background, but is working to build a life for herself in spite of all those problems. Um, and she does have some personality quirks, and she's not always completely honest. and uh, and some of the baggage that she carries around maybe isn't all that pretty. but I still liked her. But I found some readers who I don't know that they actually disliked her, but they thought that the rest of her life was going to be difficult and maybe filled with tragedy. I That surprised me that
Mm.
people had that reaction because I saw her as someone who was going to prevail, against all the problems that she was dealing with. Um, there are other characters, more minor characters, and like I say, I think I like them all. Um, the father, Nate's father, is not perfect by any means, but you sort of get a glimpse of him trying to be a better father than he's been in some ways. And the mother is struggling with, the situation of the early 60s where women, did not have opportunities to really express themselves in the world and realize their potential. And she's kind of working through that. Um, so, yeah, I like them all, I think. The main characters, I like them all.
Well, and I think they were all very believable, and just really rang true, I would say. And they all really showed throughout the book an inner growth, a kind of learning, who they were. And it was interesting to me that when you just mentioned, women's role in the early 60s, that the girl wanted to be a furniture designer, which, was for the most case, a male, job. And then later in the book, the mother, wants to go back to her original dream of being an architect. And I thought that was really an interesting um, observation to put in these characters. I thought that, and like I say, I think the growth that they all showed, the father, the mother, and, all of the main characters.
Yeah. I'm really glad to hear you say that, Christine, because, well, I like that too. And I saw that growth and I thought I was showing that growth in the characters. Um, my writing tends to be uh, not overly dramatic. There's no car chases or murders there are quieter stories of people dealing with more or less ordinary situations. But hopefully, I find the moments that are breakthrough moments, and I can add interest and excitement that way. Um, but anyway, I'm very glad to hear you say that. One person reading this, I made the mistake of giving an early manuscript to someone I didn't know very well. He was a writer, um, but he read it and he said, "Well, nothing happens. Nothing happens in this story. You have to have something happen." And I thought about that, and I thought he was exactly wrong. I mean, well, first of all, things do happen. People take different directions in their lives at the end than they were in at the beginning. But the main difference is that there's been internal growth that's happened to all of the characters, which to me is dramatic. When you have these personal breakthroughs that maybe they don't send you in a dramatically different direction, but they reorient you a little bit to life and make you a stronger and a better person. So thank you for
Well,
saying that.
now, that kind of leads to a question. What's the most surprising reaction you've had from a reader? Was that it from this early reader?
I think that was it. Yes, I really I haven't heard it from very many readers, fortunately, and I'm not sure that the people who even said it disliked the book because of that, but they sort of had a mixed feeling about my character, Audrey. Um, but yeah, that was the most surprising reaction. I didn't expect it. And for the most part, I don't think most readers felt that way about it, but there were a few. And, uh, and it's enough for me to stop and sort of think about, did I do this right? Or, you know, am I right or are they right?
Mhm. Um, so were there writers or books or real life events? Well, we talked about, the assassination that influenced this work. and maybe, your experience of working in that factory in Grand Rapids. Was there anything else you'd want to add to that about real life experiences or real life events?
Um, well, the events of the book, the background of the book is a background, as I said, that I understand and know. Um, and I'm seeing it through a young man's eyes at a time when I was a young man. So there's obviously some of myself that gets into his perceptions and reactions, but the actual events of the story are, none of that happened to me.
Right.
uh, Fortunately, maybe. So that's all made up. Um, and as far as what inspired me, uh, I think that was your question, wasn't it? What caused me to write that particular story?
Well, yeah, and what was there real life events that,
Yes,
sparked,
yes,
that idea? And I
yeah,
kind of answered that.
yeah, yeah. No, it was not anything that happened to me. I guess there was one aspect, and it shows up actually in my work from time to time. I like the idea of somebody who is not artistic by nature trying to move in that direction. And at this point in my life, having been an engineer for years and years, and then having achieved a certain amount of competence as a writer, I think I know that territory very well. And so I like to, I guess that was one reason I chose Nate to be the character he was, because, his situation, uh, having a skill in one area, math and science, but wanting to find out what art was all about and try to understand his life, through the powers that art gives you. I
Mhm.
I think I chose that deliberately.
And what's the difference between working as an engineer and working as a writer? I mean, they seem kind of two different planes of existence.
Well, they are to a certain extent. I mean, the way you do your work is different. As an engineer, you're dealing with facts and formulas, and uh, you define a problem very precisely, and you go from step to step in solving the problem, and you use the facts and the information to move along the path to coming to some kind of a discovery. But all the way along the path, you're on pretty solid ground. You're dealing with hard reality, with facts, and and so you're moving on a very stable uh, ground, you might say. And then when you reach the end, whatever you were trying to solve, whatever the problem was, you have a good deal of confidence that that is the right answer to that problem. Um, when you're dealing with art, I found you don't have any of that reassurance. You're dealing with your imagination,
Mhm.
dealing with your instincts. You make decisions using your instincts, and you're not on solid ground. You're only supported by the belief that your instincts are valid and true, and that's a little bit uncomfortable, for someone who's worked a long, long time on the other side of his brain.
Uh-huh.
But once I understood the difference, it was easier for me to deal with it. I just understood that I was going to have to push myself into this realm, this realm of imagination, and just believe that it was going to take me someplace interesting.
Well, I think it did. Now, you've lived most of your life in Michigan. How do you think that has affected your writing?
Um, well, it has. I know that it has. As I said, there's been times where I've kind of resisted being a Midwesterner in terms of being a writer, because maybe you want to set a story in a place that more people know about than Grand Rapids, Michigan. Um, but I like writing about Midwesterners. I like, the culture of the Midwest, kind of the I don't know if you call it humility, but the lack of pretense and affectation, the the ethic of hard work, family values. I like all of those things. Um, I've traveled other places. I've traveled and actually lived for periods of time in Canada and Mexico and France, and I lived in the Bay Area of California for about 3 years back in the later '60s. So I know about other places, but um, and maybe the fact that I finally returned to the Midwest to build a life, says something about me too. I just feel comfortable here. I like the people here. I like the culture of the Midwest, and I think it's an interesting culture to delve into as a writer.
Mhm.
So that's what I've
Um,
been doing.
what did it mean to have your work selected as a Michigan Notable Book?
Well, it's been extremely affirming. I had my first book was a novel that came out in 2009, Season of Water and Ice, and at that time I had no idea how the world was going to receive my writing. Um, and the sales, I mean, I was an unknown writer. Um, the sales were not very uh, encouraging at the beginning, but after having to be designated as a notable book, it was a great affirmation of me, that I was doing something that was worthwhile, and that I was doing it with some amount of skill, and the attention on the book increased. It didn't turn into a bestseller by New York Times standards, but it got some attention,
Yes.
and it was very gratifying uh, for that to happen. The affirmation that it gave me was the biggest positive that I took out of it, and as well as meeting a lot of interesting people, at the state Library of Michigan and different libraries around the state that I went to and gave presentations.
Yeah.
So it was all a very positive experience.
Um, why do you think people should read your book when there's, a zillion other things they could be doing?
Well, there
That's
sure are
kind
a
of a tricky
zillion other
question.
things. Yeah, there's more other things every day, it seems like, with the online world that we have now. Um, I I don't know exactly how to answer that. I guess I try to write something, and as I said, I try to be authentic in what I write. I try to present the world as it is, honest and true as I can make it. And and I guess the reason to read the book would be to learn about maybe people in a time and a situation that is compelling because it is so vivid. Uh, Hemingway, I think, said that if you write well, the writing can actually be more powerful than the experience of living something. You can actually add something to lived life by expressing it well in the written word. And so I guess that's what I try to do too, Christine. I try to present something that I know about as vividly and as true as I can, and just hope that people will, be interested in reading that.
Yeah. Now, one question I like to ask writers is, what other writers, who are you really reading now, or who have you been influenced by in their work? Do you have any favorite writers?
Well, I do. When I was young, I read all the writers that were popular then. The serious writers. Hemingway and Faulkner and Steinbeck. Um, and I still like to read those books. I go back to them every once in a while, and I'll read something that I read when I was a teenager or a young man, and it's an interesting experience to go back to a book that you haven't read for a long time because you find things in it. I mean, you're a different person, and so you find things in it that are different. And as someone who's worked in writing now, I sort of begin to see the structure behind the story. You know, I can kind of see what these writers were doing as they put scenes together. Um, as far as writers that I like now, I like realistic writers. You know, I like Marilyn Robinson. She's an incredible writer. Um, I like Richard Ford. His ability to draw meaning out of a simple situation is just incredible. You know, he can take a scene and spend 50 pages writing about it, and every page along the way, you know, is compelling reading. Um, I like George Saunders. He's a quite different writer um, than a lot of those that I write. He's more of a humorist in some ways, but he has sort of found a way to tell a story that is completely new and different, and he's really a master storyteller who has, by the way, a engineering background. So I'm not the only one that's made that transition. um, Otherwise, you know, just realistic writers. I like Alex McDermott. She writes about the New York area, but I enjoy her writing quite a lot. Ron Carlson, Kent Harff. I like all these writers, you know, and I think I learned something from them now. When I read a work of fiction, I'm kind of looking at it as a writer too, and trying to see the stage management, you know, behind the story.
Sure, sure. So, is there anything that you're working on that you want to talk about, or maybe you don't like to talk about what you're working on?
Well, I'm not actually, Christine, working. Well, I have scraps of things, you know, like I said, I write things and I maybe spend a day or two on them and then don't know what to do with it. So I put it away. There is something, though, that I actually worked on for quite a long period of time. I probably have a couple hundred pages written. Um, but I never could quite feel that it was coming together in a way that I liked. And I think what I'm going to do next um, is to go back to those files and pull that out and see if I can't. Uh, I think maybe I'm a little bit better writer than I was, you know, when I was doing that a few years ago. So maybe I'll find the right thread to pull, you know, to it's a story, you know, set in the Midwest in Michigan. Um, it's about a older character, a man who is going through difficulties. You know, I mean, there's things happening in his life that he's dealing with. Um, but anyway, that's about as much as I guess I should say about it because it's still evolving.
Sure, sure. Well, I appreciate your time and your comments and your insight into your work, and I hope people will read it. I'll hold the book up again, Searching for Van Gogh. I think the title really is a great title for this book because not only is Nate, searching for something, everybody in the novel is really searching for something, so, for some more meaning to life and so forth. So,
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm glad to hear that, Christine. This is the one book or story. Uh, you know, the first thing I thought of as a title was Searching for Van Gogh. And usually I choose something and then I don't like it and I go through, you know, 10 or 15 iterations before I find a title I really like. But this one was an exception. That title seemed to be exactly right from beginning to end. So
I
I'm
think
glad
it
to hear you.
worked.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, and I hope people will read the book because I think it's wonderful and it truly deserves the Michigan Notable Book
Well,
Award.
thank you very much, Christine. It's been a joy talking with you here for a few minutes. I appreciate your questions.
All right. Well, thank you.